Państwa, przechodzimy do kolejnego wykładu, kolejnej prezentacji.
Dear colleagues, let us move on to the next presentation, and now let me welcome Daria Bręczewska-Kulesza, who will speak about architectural icons of cities from the 19th and early 20th centuries.
Dzień dobry Państwu.
Good morning. I feel truly honored to be able to speak among so many distinguished speakers. So thank you very much for the invitation to your
Ja chciałabym
conference.
Państwa również przenieść nieco w przeszłość.
I also want to take you back in time, maybe not so much, but
bardzo często
reading the thesis of the conference, I started thinking about the architectural icon.
definicji mamy bardzo dużo.
We have many definitions of architectural icons, so I was wondering if this concept can be also applied to the cities from the beginning of the 19th and the early 20th century, so the early modern cities. Was this concept perceived in the same way or maybe in a different way? So following my research, I selected a few definitions. Today we refer to icons as new buildings that are surprising, that are unique. On the other hand, historic buildings that are well recognizable, unique buildings that are landmarks in cities and that are used as tools of non-verbal communications. These are the most common definitions of architectural icons. So the typical features are this unique nature, recognizability, general accessibility, originality, exceptionality, authenticity that links the building to the place and its residents, and the fact that they support the identification of cities and help it to build identity. Yes, typically we associate these architectural icons with specific cities. So what are these icons? Ancient buildings, certainly like Egyptian pyramids or temples, Greek temples, amphitheaters, including the Roman Colosseum, as well as medieval architecture. We are in Krakow, so we typically associate Krakow with the royal castle or with a cathedral. Malbork would be associated with a castle as well. The Notre Dame Cathedral would be associated with Paris, even though we have many cathedrals dedicated to Mary all over France. Then engineering structures. They have become icons in the modern sense of the word. I have added many of them, including the Eiffel Tower, and I believe that many other buildings will come to my and our minds. But certain contemporary structures have or are trying to reach the status of an icon. Well, the time will tell if they will succeed. There are a number of buildings from the 20th century that we also closely link to specific cities that built the identity of these places. But the questions I wanted to ask ourselves are different. Can we refer to the 19th century buildings as architectural icons? Were they referred to as such icons when they were built, or is it our thinking that is being overlaid on them? and why we have selected some buildings rather than others to be the icons. So I tried to apply these criteria to the 19th century cities, and I tried to look at these cities with the eyes of the inhabitants of the cities at that time. So let us move back in time to the period when these cities were being erected. Were these buildings unique at that time? Were they characterized by this unique nature within the urban tissue? Well, we can say that they distinguished themselves from the rest of the building, but given the fact that we did have globalization to some extent already entering our minds, I believe that the most unique ventures were the great engineering investments. This was something that was widely written about. Well, recognizability. I believe it was also local, so the buildings were recognizable in a specific region, but in a broader sense, they were known to the experts on architecture, to artists. They were described in professional journals, and of course, they were recognized by the residents locally themselves. Well, the uniqueness and originality. Well, the 19th century was not particularly original. There were certain buildings that were recognizable because of the function. Today, when walking along the city centers, we do recognize the old building of a post office or a railway station. So they were not particularly original. They repeated themselves within specific countries, or in Poland when we think about the influence zones during the partition. The most important issue of these buildings, I do not want to call them icons, were the contribution to building the identity of a place and the accessibility to the general public. What we need to bear in mind is the fact that at that point the identity and the identification of cities were built in a completely different manner. There was no internet, obviously. At that time, the cities were promoted mostly via postcards. So the key landmarks, parks, buildings, theaters, museums, or other public buildings were being documented on postcards. There were also guidebooks with many photographs that presented the urban achievements that were the source of pride. These guidebooks were written a little bit differently, so we were used to speak about industry, or were also meant to invite other people to come and settle in the city, praising the good living conditions. Obviously, there was also specialist press that described new buildings. For instance, there was a villa in Bydgoszcz that was written about in Germany, so even smaller townships could find their way into professional magazines and journals. I have selected a few categories of buildings that performed new functions or were absent from cities until the 19th century. So they distinguished themselves, they stood out in this urban fabric, and they had special function. I refer to them as temples because people visited them on special days. These were not buildings that would be attended on a day-to-day basis. Typically, people would be dressed up, so they were treated differently. I divided them into 5 categories: the temples of arts and sciences, the temples of money, power, technology, and the urban lifestyle, because that was the period when the urban lifestyle started to be formed as the population started to move towards cities. So some of these buildings existed before, but not in the same form as in the 19th century. So the temples of arts and scientists, so theaters, operas, music halls, concert halls, museums that were attended by even bigger numbers of people than today. These buildings referred to the archaeology, to the architecture of the ancient temples, and thus the double meaning of this word temple. So these buildings stood out from the urban tissue. They were erected on main squares. They were often surrounded by greenery. They were also often large. That depends on a city, and they were often also promoted on postcards. They also indicated the high social status of a city. Every city wanted to have a theater, because otherwise nobody would come to live there. So these were the places of entertainment and so on. There were also museums where you could find out many interesting things. These were not only art museums, but also theme museums. And so these are the references to there were also frequent references to these ancient temples that emphasized this status of these buildings. Well, the second category, the temples of money, so banks. And here we have a variety of buildings with different functions. So banks that gained the importance with the development of cities. Many entrepreneurs needed money, so these institutions grew in size, and they had to look appropriately. So they needed to have impressive seats that would combine this temple symbolic. So this is the edifice of the Bank of Lithuania. And they also wanted to exhibit, to show that the money they lent were used to promote technology. And also commodity or stocks exchanges developed very fast. The buildings became greater, more transactions were taking place, and they also had to stand out from the urban tissue. And finally, the representative buildings that were both the seats and the representative buildings of companies. So most of them were, for instance, insurance firms, such as the Corona Palace in Prague. That was the seat of a joint stock company offering life insurance. Well, such buildings often also contained some living quarters, but they were to showcase the wealth of the company. And then the temples of power. There were many representative, huge, impressive edifices hosting parliaments and courts that had to match the position of the authority. The decoration relied on the history of the region, the judicial tradition. They contained a number of symbolic elements. Today we have some difficulties reading these symbols, but people in the 19th century were educated enough to recognize them. And the last type of temples are the temples of technology. So engineering structures, bridges, buildings related to railway, to underground structures, because many underground lines were being constructed at that time. Also factories, many of them were constructed in this modern technology, and sometimes there were buildings as this library, Saint-Geneviève library in Paris, that had an internal structure that was displayed. It was still being ornamented, but it was being shown, it was not covered. And finally, the temples of new lifestyle. This is what I refer to parks, huge green areas created in the second half of the 19th and at the beginning of the 20th century, when people realized that once you live crowded in your urban townhouses, well, you need some space to relax. These parks were very important. They were fitted with recreational infrastructure. You could row, you could use a boat, you could listen to a concert. So you could spend your time nicely if the weather was fine. And this is just a leaflet advertising healthy lifestyle. And here the Hyde Park in London is referred to as the green lungs of the city. I don't know what it was like elsewhere, but in the Prussian sphere of influence, every resident was expected to live within a certain reach from a park. So there were many parks being established in cities at that time. And to sum up, let me say that the 19th century produced its specific architectural icons. I believe that from the perspective of the resident of cities from that time, we would approach this topic completely differently. They were used differently, construed differently than today. They were rather some landmarks promoting the city, promoting both the big cities as well as smaller townships. And that's the same role these icons perform today. So that was an advantage of a city. Every city had something to promote on a postcard. Today, taking into account the costs of constructing the icons as we understand them, well, it is not within the financial reach of every single town. And many of the buildings erected at the end of the 19th and at the beginning of the 20th century are the buildings that we do associate with specific cities. These include the university buildings, buildings used by authorities, theaters, operas, or famous parks. They originated in the 19th century. There are also many landmarks, icons recognizable locally. If we live in a certain area, we still recognize them unless they were destroyed during the Second World War. They make cities and towns more charming and they build its identity. Certainly the reason for the survival of these rather than other buildings was the fact that they became part of the urban tissue. They performed important functions and they were deemed important by the residents. So those buildings that have kept their status of an icon to this day will remain icons. But those that were erected recently, well, we need to wait and see whether they will keep their identity of an icon. And here one more image. Well, it's an icon of a different type, not related to a city, related to a king that nearly ruined a state by building this edifice, but certainly it is an architectural icon as well. Thank you very much for your attention.